The sky was still dark when the engines began to wake. At first, it was only a low rumble, like a distant storm rolling across empty fields. But slowly the sound grew fuller, deeper, until it filled the air with a heavy vibration that settled into the chest of every man standing near the runway. The ground trembled, the metal shimmered in the cold morning light, and a long row of B-17 bombers came alive one by one, their propellers cutting through the fog like great spinning blades of destiny. It was the sound of another mission. Another gamble with fate. Another day when some crews would fly into the sky and never return. In those early hours before the sun lifted its first light over the horizon, the world felt strangely quiet. There were no birds singing, no voices raised in laughter, no footsteps moving without purpose. Everything seemed to hold its breath. Even the wind waited, as if it knew what was about to happen. A new mission was forming in the cold air, wrapped in fear, wrapped in courage, wrapped in the strange mix of hope and dread that only men who fly into danger can truly understand. Inside one of those B-17s, a young crew sat in silence. They were not new to this. They had flown before. They had seen the fire in the sky. They had felt the sting of fear in their stomachs and the weight of responsibility on their shoulders. They had watched other planes fall from the formation, torn apart by gunfire or swallowed by thick clouds of black smoke. They had survived missions that should have ended their story. And now they were preparing to do it again. Perhaps this was where it all began, not with a single mission, not with a single day, but with a quiet understanding that they were part of something larger than themselves. A machine of war built on metal and courage. A world suspended thousands of feet above the earth, where each second could be the last. When the pilot placed his hands on the controls, they felt steady, calm, almost peaceful. He did not show the fear that pressed against him. He had learned to hide it. A leader must be the anchor for the others. Even when his heart raced, his voice stayed steady. Even when his thoughts drifted to the families waiting at home, he kept his eyes forward. The bomber itself felt like a living creature, its engines breathing, its metal structure groaning softly as if stretching before a long journey. The crew trusted this machine with their lives. They knew every sound it made, every shiver in its wings, every vibration through the floor. They could tell when something was wrong just by listening. That was the strange bond between a crew and their plane. In time, it felt less like flying a machine and more like working with an old friend who carried them through the sky. The fog began to thin. The morning light grew stronger. The runway stretched ahead like a long, narrow bridge between safety and danger. And somewhere beyond that horizon, the enemy waited. Hidden guns. Fast fighters. Black clouds of exploding shells. The sky was not a peaceful place anymore. It was a battlefield. When the order finally came through, simple, clear, without emotion, the pilot pushed the throttle forward. The engines roared, shaking the earth beneath them. The plane rolled forward, slow at first, then faster, as if the earth itself were trying to hold them back. The wheels bounced slightly against the runway, then steadied, then lifted. And with a gentle rise, the bomber left the world of solid ground and entered the vast open sky. Below them, the base grew smaller and smaller until it faded into the soft gray morning. Above them, the sky opened like a great endless sea. The crew settled into their positions, checking their instruments, tightening their gear, preparing themselves for the hours ahead. Each man knew his role. Each man knew that the lives of the others depended on him. The formation grew as more B-17s joined in. One by one, they appeared from the fog, wings shining, engines humming like a massive choir rising toward the heavens. Dozens of bombers moved together, forming a single powerful force. There was something beautiful about it, something almost poetic. A ballet of steel and thunder. But beauty in wartime is always mixed with danger. These formations were targets. They were visible from miles away. And the enemy knew exactly how to find them. As the planes climbed higher, the temperature dropped sharply. The windows frosted at the edges. The air turned thin and biting. Breath turned into mist. Gloves grew stiff. The sky looked peaceful, but the cold was a reminder. Nothing about this world was gentle. Still, the crew carried on. They adjusted their masks, checked their guns, tightened their straps, and waited. The mission had begun, and the point of no return had already passed behind them. Somewhere deep inside, each man felt the same quiet question. Will we return today? No one spoke it out loud. They didn't have to. The answer would come in time, written in smoke, fire, and the choices they would make in the hours ahead. For now the sky held them. Suspended. Waiting. Watching. And far in the distance, beyond the horizon, danger slowly woke up too. Higher and higher the formation climbed, until the world below became nothing more than a patchwork of fields, rivers, and quiet villages still sleeping under the soft morning haze. The engines pulsed like a steady heartbeat, 8 spinning propellers from 4 massive power plants pushing the bomber through layers of cold blue air. From inside the aircraft, the view was almost peaceful, almost gentle, as if the world had forgotten the violence waiting just beyond the horizon. But the men inside the B-17 knew better. They had flown this route too many times to be fooled by the beauty of the morning sky. Behind the calm surface of the world, danger sat quietly, like a shadow waiting for the right moment to step forward. Inside the bomber, the narrow passageways rattled softly with each shift of the wings. The smell of oil and metal filled the air. The floor vibrated under their boots. Every surface felt icy to the touch. This was their flying world, cramped, loud, cold, and alive with unseen tension. You could hear the engines through every part of the aircraft, like a deep, constant growl that never stopped. In the nose compartment, the bombardier adjusted his sighting gear. He wiped the frost from the glass and took a deep breath. He had one of the heaviest responsibilities on the plane. At the final moment of the mission, it would be his hands making the decision that affected not just the target below, but the entire crew above. A mistake could mean disaster. A delay could mean missing the target completely. It was a duty that required calmness in the middle of chaos. Behind him, the navigator traced out the course on a small map illuminated by a dim red light. The table shook every few seconds, forcing him to steady his pencil. He checked his compass, checked the time, checked the wind drift. He knew that if he misjudged even slightly, the bomber could drift into enemy airspace at the wrong angle and fall into a deadly trap. His job was not loud or dramatic. It was slow and careful, built on numbers and angles and trust. Above them, in the top turret, the gunner scanned the sky with sharp, focused eyes. He watched for tiny specks that might suddenly grow into fast-moving fighters. The cold wind hissed through small gaps in the turret as it rotated. His hands, covered in heavy gloves, rested on the twin .50 caliber guns. He had seen what enemy fighters could do to a B-17. He had seen planes vanish in seconds under a storm of gunfire. He knew that once the attack began, every second mattered. Farther back in the radio room, the operator listened through heavy static. He adjusted the dials with practiced ease, trying to catch faint signals buried under waves of noise. Messages came through slowly, coded and brief. Some were updates. Others were warnings. Sometimes, the voice on the other end carried a tension that made him pause. He never ignored those moments. The radio could mean life or death. In the waist section of the plane, the 2 gunners stood ready near their windows. The wind roared through the thin metal walls. Their guns pointed outward like watchful eyes. They knew that when enemy fighters came, they would come fast. They would move like shadows, appearing and disappearing in the blink of an eye. There would be no time to think, only to react. And in the tail gunner sat in the loneliest seat in the entire aircraft. Isolated, facing backwards, exposed to the cold more than anyone else. He watched the sky behind them, the place where danger often arrived without warning. He had learned to read the movements of fighter planes, to sense the rhythm of their attacks. He had learned that the quiet moments could end in an instant. At the front of it all, the pilot and co-pilot worked together, hands steady on the controls. They listened to the hum of the engines, felt the weight of the plane under their fingertips, and kept their eyes fixed on the endless stretch of sky ahead. Leading a mission like this required a strange mix of confidence and humility. You had to trust yourself, trust your crew, trust the aircraft, and at the same time accept that the sky could turn against you at any moment. As the bomber continued its steady climb, the sun finally broke over the horizon. A soft golden light touched the clouds and lit the formation in a glow that made the planes look almost peaceful, almost gentle. From the ground, they might have looked beautiful, a line of silver birds gliding toward the rising sun. But from inside, beauty was the last thing on their minds. Far ahead, the sky began to change. The clouds grew darker. Thin lines of smoke curled upward from distant battlefields. And somewhere beneath the layers of gray and blue, enemy guns were already turning toward the sound of approaching engines. The formation tightened. Pilots adjusted their positions, wings almost touching, each aircraft holding its place with precise discipline. The B-17s moved like a single living organism, every piece connected, every movement synchronized. Staying close meant safety. Drifting away meant isolation, and isolation in the sky could be deadly. Inside the crew compartments, the men felt the shift. The calm of the climb was ending. The mission was truly beginning now. They checked their equipment again, adjusted their masks, tightened their gloves. Each man entered his own quiet space, a small world inside his mind. Memories rose, family, friends, promises, hopes, but they pushed them down again. In combat, the mind had to be clear. The pilot looked over the formation and felt a familiar heaviness settle in his chest. He had flown enough missions to recognize the signs. The stillness before the storm. The distant rumble that wasn't thunder but something far more dangerous. The way the sky seemed to shift in color as if warning them of what was to come. He spoke softly into the intercom, his voice calm but steady. "Stay sharp. This is where it starts." The crew listened. They nodded. They understood. Ahead of them, still hidden in the haze of the horizon, the enemy waited. And for the 25th time, this crew prepared to fly into the heart of danger, carrying nothing but their training, their trust in one another, and the quiet hope that today, just like the days before, they would find a way to return. War in the air was unlike anything the world had seen before. On the ground, a soldier could hide behind walls, trenches, or the curve of the earth. But in the sky there was nothing to protect you. No trees. No shadows. No escape. Only open air stretching in every direction, and the knowledge that thousands of feet below lay a world you might never touch again. By the time the B-17 became one of the main bombers of the Allied forces, the skies over Europe had turned into one of the most dangerous battlegrounds on Earth. It was a place where machines groaned under pressure, where men fought not only the enemy but the cold, the wind, and the fear that came with each new mission. The B-17 was called the Flying Fortress for good reason. Its body was thick with armor. Its guns pointed in almost every direction. Its engines were powerful and reliable. But even a fortress in the air had limits. A single well-placed shell could split it open. A fast fighter could tear through its defenses if the timing was right. And no matter how strong the plane was, the men inside were still human. Survival rates made that painfully clear. In the early years of the air campaign, a bomber crew had to complete 25 missions before they could go home. But many never reached that number. Some made it to 10. Some to 5. Some never returned from their first flight. The statistics were frightening to look at, but for the men flying these missions, they weren't just numbers. They were empty bunks. Silence at the dinner table. A story cut short. Yet these crews kept flying day after day into skies filled with fire. Each mission had a rhythm, a pattern that repeated itself like the beat of a drum. It began with the quiet of the morning, the engines warming, the long climb into thin air. Then came the gathering of the formation, the tightening of the group into a solid wall of bombers. After that, the long, steady flight toward enemy territory. The tension always built slowly, creeping into their hearts like a cold wind. They knew what waited ahead: flak bursts, enemy fighters, and the unpredictable nature of war. Flak was one of the most terrifying parts of flight. It came from heavy guns on the ground, firing shells that exploded in the air. These black bursts filled the sky, each one a deadly cloud of metal fragments that could tear through a wing or smash into a fuel tank. The bursts looked almost like dark flowers blooming in the sky, but there was nothing beautiful about them. They meant danger. They meant pain. They meant loss. When the bombers flew into thick flak zones, the sky changed around them. The air filled with explosions. The plane shook violently. The sound was like continuous thunder, each blast closer than the last. The crew held on tightly, hoping the next burst wouldn't be the one that tore their plane apart. They couldn't dodge the flak, The bombers had to fly straight and level so the bombs would hit the target. Flying straight through danger required incredible courage. And then there were the fighters. Fast, sharp, silent until the last second. German fighters were highly skilled, flying machines built for speed and attack. They approached from every angle, from above, from below, head-on, from behind. They looked like specks at first, tiny dots on the horizon. But in seconds they grew into dark shapes with wings pointed like arrows. The moment a gunner saw them, he shouted the warning, and the plane exploded into movement. Turrets spun. Guns opened fire. The air filled with broken metal and burning fuel. Some fighters attacked in groups, diving together in perfect coordination. Others circled the formation like wolves searching for the weak plane that drifted too far from the group. The gunners fired until their hands were numb, until the barrels glowed faintly, until the enemy planes pulled away or fell flaming through the sky. Inside the bomber, the noise was so loud it felt like the world itself was cracking open. The sound of the engines, the roar of the guns, the blast of shells, the clatter of metal shaking under stress, it all combined into one endless storm. And through it all, the crew had to keep moving, keep thinking, keep acting. Fear could not be allowed to freeze them. It was in moments like these that the B-17 showed its true heart. Even when hit, even when engines failed, even when pieces tore away, the plane often kept flying. It could limp home on fewer engines. It could glide when fuel ran low. Crews trusted it because they had seen it survive things that seemed impossible. But trust alone didn't keep them alive. It was the teamwork, the deep, unspoken bond between the men. They knew each other's strengths, each other's fears. They spoke through glances, through short words, through instincts built from flying together again and again. They didn't need speeches. They didn't need orders shouted in panic. They moved like parts of the same machine, each man supporting the others. During the early missions, the crew learned quickly that courage wasn't loud or dramatic. Courage was quiet. It was the steady breath taken before pulling the trigger. It was the calm voice of the navigator guiding them through a storm of flak. It was the pilot's hands holding the controls steady when every part of the aircraft wanted to shake apart. It was the simple act of showing up each morning, knowing what waited in the sky. By the 10th mission, the crew understood the true meaning of survival. It wasn't just about skill or luck. It was about endurance, the mental strength to face fear again and again without letting it take control. By the 15th mission, they had become veterans. Their movements smoother. Their reactions faster. Their instincts sharper. But with each mission survived came the weight of knowing that others had not made it back. Empty spots appeared in the formation. New crews arrived to replace those lost. Faces changed, but the mission remained the same. By the 20th mission, something deeper changed inside them. The fear was still there, always there, but it didn't control them. It moved quietly in the background, like a shadow they had learned to ignore. They flew with a strange mix of calmness and readiness, knowing that any moment might be their last, but also knowing that they were not facing it alone. And then came the missions that would test every skill they had, every ounce of strength, every thread of hope holding them together. Missions where the sky itself seemed to fight against them. Missions where the enemy pressed harder, the weather grew worse, the noise grew louder, and the world above the clouds turned into a place where only the brave could continue. Their journey was far from over. The hardest moments were still ahead. The moments that would push them to the edge of their endurance and beyond. The morning of their turning point mission began like all the others, quiet, cold, and filled with a heavy tension that clung to the air. But even before the engine started, something felt different. The sky looked darker, as if clouds were hiding something behind them. The wind carried a strange stillness, the kind that made men look up without knowing why. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it. Today would not be an ordinary mission. The crew moved with practiced discipline. They checked their gear, tightened their jackets, whispered a few private thoughts into the quiet morning. Some prayed. Some stayed silent. Some looked at the sky with a steady gaze, refusing to show the fear tightening inside their chest. Even the most experienced men had moments when the weight of war felt too heavy. Today was one of those days. Reports had come in earlier. The route would take them deep into enemy territory, farther than almost any mission before. Enemy fighters were expected in large numbers. Flak guns were positioned across the target zone. Weather would be rough. Visibility poor. But the mission had to be flown. The war depended on it. And once again the crew stepped forward to do their part. When the engines started, the ground vibrated beneath their boots. The deep roar felt familiar, almost comforting, like the heartbeat of a giant machine ready to face the sky. As the bomber rolled out, the early light revealed long rows of aircraft preparing for takeoff, each one carrying men who hoped, quietly, desperately, that they would return before nightfall. The takeoff was smooth, but the climb was rough. The wind pushed against them, shaking the wings slightly. Ice began to form at the edges of the windows. As they rose into the higher altitudes, the temperature dropped so fast it felt like stepping into another world, a world of cold silence and thin air. The sky opened up wide, a pale blue ceiling stretching endlessly above them. At first the flight felt routine. The formation gathered together, each plane holding its position like pieces of a giant puzzle moving through the sky. The engines hummed with steady rhythm. The crew settled into their stations, eyes scanning the empty horizon. Everything seemed calm. But calm never lasted long. It began with small things. A flicker on the horizon. A burst of static over the radio. A change in the tone of the wind. Experienced crews learned to recognize these signs. They meant that something was coming. Something dangerous. The crackling voice came over the radio. Enemy fighters spotted. The crew tensed. The gunners gripped their controls. The pilot steadied his breathing. They looked into the distance, trying to find the shapes that would soon fill the sky. At first, the fighters were just tiny specks, so small they looked like dust floating in the sunlight. But as the seconds passed, those specks grew sharper, darker, moving with unbelievable speed. Their wings glinted. Their engines roared. In moments they were close enough to see clearly, sleek, fast, deadly machines cutting through the sky like arrows. The attack began with frightening speed. The first fighters came head-on. A straight-line attack meant to break the formation. Tracer rounds lit up the sky, streaking past the cockpit windows in bright orange streaks. The wind screamed as bullets tore through the air. The nose gunner fired back, his whole body shaking with the force of the guns. The bomber shuddered as enemy rounds struck the metal skin, each impact ringing like a hammer against steel. The top turret spun rapidly. The gunner fired at a fighter diving from above, the barrel glowing faintly from the heat. The air filled with noise, guns roaring, engines howling, radios crackling with warnings. The sky no longer felt wide. It felt tight, heavy, filled with danger from every angle. The waist gunners saw fighters sweeping in from the sides. They opened fire, shells rattling through the plane. The recoil pushed them back slightly with each burst. Spent casings clattered across the floor. Smoke filled the cold air, stinging their eyes. But they kept firing. They had to. A sudden explosion rocked the plane. A piece of the wing tore away in a spray of metal fragments. The plane lurched violently, dropping several feet before the pilot regained control. Alarms rang. The crew shouted through the intercom. For a moment, fear gripped every heart inside the aircraft. But the plane held. Another burst of flak erupted nearby, sending black smoke across the windshield. The pilot wiped the condensation from his mask and pushed forward. They couldn't turn back. The formation needed them. The mission needed them. More fighters came. Dozens. So many that the sky seemed filled with moving shadows. They darted around the bombers like wolves surrounding a herd, looking for the weakest one. For a moment, it felt impossible, like no human could survive the storm of fire. Then came the strike that nearly ended everything. A fighter approached from below. The tail gunner shouted a warning, but it was too late. A burst of cannon fire hit the underside of the plane, shaking it violently. One of the engines sputtered. Then another. The aircraft tilted dangerously, losing altitude. Inside, the crew held on as the plane dropped. The wind roared. Loose equipment flew across the cabin. The tail gunner's voice broke through the chaos, shouting that the fighter was circling for another attack. And then something incredible happened. The bomber leveled out. The pilot gritted his teeth, fighting the failing controls. The co-pilot supported him, steadying the aircraft with every ounce of strength they had. Even with 2 engines damaged, the B-17 refused to fall. But they were not safe yet. Another wave of fighters approached. The gunners aimed again, their muscles trembling from exhaustion and cold. Their vision blurred, but their focus stayed sharp. They fired with everything they had left. One enemy plane burst into flames and spiraled downward. Another pulled away with smoke trailing from its wing. The formation held together, protecting each other as best they could. One plane would cover the next, and the next would cover another. It was a dance of survival written in bullets and courage. Slowly, painfully, the enemy fighters began to fall back. They had done their damage. They had taken their risks. And now they retreated, leaving behind a sky filled with smoke and silence. For a moment, no one spoke. The bomber was wounded. Metal panels were torn open. 2 engines rattled with strange vibrations. The oxygen system flickered. The radio buzzed weakly. But the plane was still flying. Inside, the crew took a breath, shaky, cold, but alive. They had survived the first wave. The hardest part was yet to come. Ahead lay the target. Ahead lay the flak fields. Ahead lay the true test of their 25 missions. The sky ahead darkened as the bomber approached the target zone. Clouds thickened into heavy gray layers, hiding the world below. The cold sharpened, pushing through the metal walls and settling into the bones of every man inside. The crew could feel the change even without seeing it. This was the part of the mission where the sky itself seemed to tense, as if preparing for the violence that was about to unfold. The intercom crackled. The bombardier's calm voice came through. Approaching target area. Prepare for flak. The words carried a weight everyone understood. No matter how many missions they had flown, flak was something that never became easier. It was unpredictable. It was violent. It could tear off a wing or punch through the cockpit. It did not aim. It simply filled the sky with explosions and hoped that something flying through the clouds would not make it out. The pilot steadied the plane, keeping it level. Bombers had to fly straight during a bombing run. No sharp turns. No evasive moves. No weaving. Even when explosions surrounded them, they had to stay steady so the bombs would fall where they were needed. In the nose of the aircraft, the bombardier lowered himself into position. He adjusted the bomb sight, wiped frost from the glass, and focused. He felt the familiar tension in his stomach, the same feeling he had before every drop. He knew that lives on the ground depended on him. He knew that the lives in the plane depended on finishing this run quickly. There was no room for mistakes. Outside, the first flak burst appeared, far away at first, just a dark flower blooming in the afternoon sky. Then another. And another. The bursts grew closer, darker, sharper. Black smoke filled the air in front of the formation. Each explosion sent fragments of metal flying at deadly speeds. The bomber flew straight into the storm. The first blast near them felt like a giant hand hitting the side of the plane. The metal walls shook. The floor rattled. The gunner in the nose gripped his equipment tightly as the aircraft lifted and then dropped slightly from the shock. Another burst exploded above the right wing. Shrapnel struck the metal surface, leaving dents and tearing holes. The engine coughed once, twice, but kept running. The pilot whispered something under his breath. No one heard what he said, but it was clear from his expression that he was asking the plane to hold on a little longer. Inside the cockpit, visibility blurred. Smoke mixed with condensation. The windshield cracked at the corner, a spiderweb of white lines spreading slowly across the glass. But the pilot did not flinch. His eyes stayed forward. He had flown through worse. He knew panic would only make things worse. The formation pushed deeper into the flak field. The air shook again and again. Explosions lit up the sky like dark lightning. Sometimes the blasts were so bright they lit the inside of the plane for a brief moment, showing the faces of the crew, eyes wide, jaws tight, breaths held. The waist gunners held onto their guns as the floor jumped beneath them. Even though fighters were not attacking now, they kept their guns ready. Flak wasn't the only danger. A damaged fighter might still appear from below or from behind. The sky was filled with too many unknowns. The bombardier's voice came through the intercom again, steady but tense. 30 seconds. Everyone held their breath. 30 seconds in normal life was nothing. but in a flak field it felt like a lifetime. Every burst felt closer. Every sound felt sharper. The walls groaned. The engines roared louder, fighting to stay balanced in the shaking air. The bombardier focused on the target through his sight. Slowly, steadily the image aligned. His hand stayed calm even as the sky tore itself apart around him. He called out softly, "Bombs away." The plane lifted as the weight released. The bombs fell silently at first, small dark shapes disappearing into the clouds below. The moment they dropped, the pilot pulled the bomber slightly upward, ready to break away as soon as the bombardier confirmed the release. "Good drop. Let's get out." The plane turned. Not sharply, but enough to break free from the long, deadly path of the flak corridor. As they pulled away, the sky behind them erupted into more bursts, as if angry that the bomber dared to escape its reach. The crew let out breath they didn't know they were holding. Some closed their eyes for a moment. Others checked their equipment. The worst of the flak was behind them, but the mission was not over. They still had to fly all the way back through enemy territory. They still had to survive whatever waited beyond the clouds. As the bomber left the heaviest flak zone, a strange quiet settled over the crew. The kind of quiet that comes only after surviving something incredibly dangerous. The engines hummed steadily, but each man could still hear the echo of explosions ringing in his head. Then suddenly the radio operator called out, "Fighters returning." The crew snapped back to full alert. The quiet moment vanished, replaced by sharp focus. From the side windows the waist gunners spotted movement. Dark shapes weaving between clouds. The enemy was coming again, faster this time, more aggressive, hoping to catch the formation as it left the target. The top turret spun. The tail gunner shouted a warning. The pilot tightened his grip on the controls. The fighters approached like arrows fired from invisible bows. The battle restarted with violent energy. A fighter dove straight at them from above, guns blazing. The top turret answered with a burst that shook the entire plane. Tracers filled the air, streaks of red and white cutting through the blue sky. Another fighter swooped up from below, targeting the underside of the bomber. The belly gunner opened fire, his breathing fast and controlled. The enemy plane banked sharply and pulled away, smoke trailing from its engine. But the bomber wasn't untouched. A burst of cannon fire struck the left wing again, tearing a long strip of metal and exposing wires that sparked in the freezing air. The wing dipped dangerously. The pilot fought it, muscles tensed, face pale with effort. Hold together," he whispered through clenched teeth. The plane obeyed. One by one, enemy fighters broke off and retreated. The formation had held. The gunners had pushed them back. The bomber had survived again, but it was badly wounded. Inside, the crew knew the hardest part was coming. They were far from home. 2 engines were struggling. Fuel was lower than expected. And the weather ahead looked rough. But no one spoke of doubt. They were too far into the mission to think of anything except getting back. As the bomber turned toward home, the sky behind them faded into gray distance. Smoke drifted from damaged metal. Cold wind rushed through new holes in the fuselage. The crew checked each other, reassured each other, steadied their breathing. They were alive. And as long as the engines kept turning, they had a chance. Ahead of them, somewhere beyond the clouds, home waited. The journey home was always the quietest part of the mission, but quiet did not mean safe. It was a fragile silence, the kind that came after a storm but before anyone knew whether another would rise. Inside the B-17, the crew felt the shift immediately. Their bodies were still tense from the fight. Their breathing had not yet returned to normal. The ringing in their ears had not yet faded. But they were heading home, and that single thought carried a small warmth inside their cold, exhausted hearts. The pilot glanced at the engine gauges. 2 engines were running rough, each vibration more worrying than the last. Oil pressure dipped. The needles shook. The plane was still flying, but it was not flying well. It felt heavier, slower, as if dragging invisible weight through the sky. The pilot knew the risks. A wounded bomber deep in enemy territory was easy prey. But turning back was not an option. Forward was the only direction that mattered. The navigator calculated the new course. He wiped sweat from his forehead even though the air was freezing. His pencil shook slightly as he marked the map. The damaged engines meant they couldn't keep up with the formation. Slowly, painfully, the bomber began to fall behind. The other planes pulled ahead, still moving in tight formation, still protected by each other's guns. But this crew was drifting away from them, alone now in the wide, dangerous sky. The tail gunner noticed it first. He saw the distance growing. He saw the small gap widen into a space large enough to swallow a plane whole. He knew what this meant. The formation was a shield, strength in numbers, a wall of guns facing every direction. Alone they were exposed. He spoke quietly through the intercom. "We're falling behind." No one answered. They didn't need to. They all saw it. They all felt it. The wind pushed against the bomber more harshly now. The cold crept deeper through the torn metal skin. The sound of the engines grew uneven, like a tired heartbeat struggling to stay steady. The radio operator tried to send a message to the group, but the signal was weak, distorted by damage. It crackled into nothingness. The sky thickened into gray clouds. Visibility dropped. The bomber moved through the mist like a lone ghost dragging itself through an empty world. Every man listened for the sound they feared most. The distant hum of enemy engines returning to finish what they started. The waist gunners kept their eyes pressed to the cold glass. Every small movement in the clouds made their hearts jump. A shadow. A flicker. A dark shape that could be a fighter or simply a trick of the light. The tension was sharp, unbroken. Even breathing felt like a noise that might attract danger. Minutes passed. Long minutes. Heavy minutes. Then, through the fog, the top turret gunner saw something. A faint shape behind them, closing in slowly. He blinked, held his breath, and stared harder. It was there again, the shadow of a plane, moving carefully, almost silently. He called out, "Something behind us." Not sure what yet. Everyone froze. The tail gunner strained his eyes, scanning the horizon. The shadow moved closer, but not fast. Not aggressive. It held its distance. It watched. Then, as the clouds thinned for a moment, the shape became clear. A lone German fighter. The tail gunner inhaled sharply. His hands tightened on the triggers. But something was strange. The fighter did not attack. It stayed far enough to follow but not close enough to fire. It drifted to the left, then to the right, almost lazily as if studying the wounded bomber. The crew didn't know what to make of it. Was it waiting for reinforcements? Was it playing with him? Was it the beginning of another fight they had no strength left to face? The pilot kept his eyes forward, but he could feel the tension behind him. Fighters rarely followed without attacking. There had to be a reason. The German fighter moved again, drawing closer on the right side of the bomber. The top turret swung toward it. The waist gunner aimed. The tail gunner followed it with his sights. But the fighter pilot raised his hand. He lifted it slowly, clearly showing the universal sign. "I'm not attacking." The crew stared in confusion. The moment felt unreal. After hours of violence, how could there be a pause? Why would an enemy show mercy in the middle of war? The fighter moved closer, still keeping a respectful distance. The German pilot looked straight at the bomber crew. His face was calm, almost sad. He studied the torn wings, the damaged engines, the holes punched through the fuselage. He saw the smoke, the frozen edges of broken metal, the signs of a plane barely holding itself together. Maybe he saw something else too. Maybe he saw men. Not enemies. Not targets. Just human beings trying to stay alive. The fighter drifted to the side again. For a moment, the two planes flew together. Two machines built for destruction, now sharing the same sky in silence. Then, in a smooth motion, the German pilot dipped his wings. A gesture of respect. A farewell. And then he turned away, disappearing into the clouds without firing a single shot. Inside the bomber, the crew sat in stunned silence. No words came. No one knew how to describe what had just happened. War was filled with horror, but sometimes, rarely, it revealed a moment of humanity that made no sense and yet made all the sense in the world. The navigator finally spoke, his voice soft. "Let's get home." They pressed on. The weather worsened. Wind battered the wings. Snowflakes slapped against the glass. Clouds turned darker and thicker. The engines groaned like old tired creatures begging for rest. But the pilot coaxed them, encouraged them, pushed them gently through the storm. The bomber fought through turbulence and freezing air, losing altitude slowly but steadily. The crew felt every drop. Their ears popped. Their hands shook. Their eyes burned from exhaustion. But they kept going. 1 hour passed. Then another. The bomber crossed out of enemy territory, invisible under clouds but moving towards safety. The radio crackled again, this time with a faint friendly voice. The operator responded quickly, relief washing through him like warm water. They were close. The ground below slowly changed shape. Familiar rivers and roads appeared through breaks in the clouds. The base was not far now. Home was finally within reach. But as they descended through the freezing air, the left engine sputtered violently. Then it stopped completely. The plane lurched. The pilot steadied it again, jaw tightening. 3 engines left. Then 2. The final stretch felt like lifting a mountain. The runway appeared faintly through the mist. The co-pilot whispered, almost too quietly to hear, "Just a little more." The bomber dipped, then leveled. The wheels touched the ground. The metal groaned. The plane rolled forward, slowing, until finally it stopped. Silence. Real silence. Not the silence of fear or waiting, but the silence of survival. The crew looked at each other with eyes full of exhaustion and disbelief. They had made it. Against everything. Against storms, fighters, flak, failing engines, and the endless reach of the war. They had survived 25 missions. And as they stepped out of the battered bomber, touching the solid earth beneath their feet, they understood something very simple and very powerful. It wasn't the strongest plane that brought them home. It wasn't the best aim or the fastest reflexes. It was the bond between them, the trust, the courage, the quiet promise that no matter what happened in the sky, they would face it together. When the engines finally wound down and the propellers slowed to a stop, the sudden quiet felt almost unreal. 4 hours the crew had lived inside a world of noise, roaring engines, exploding shells, screaming wind, the harsh clatter of gunfire. Now there was nothing but stillness. Just the soft ticking of cooling metal and the faint whisper of wind brushing across the battered fuselage. They stepped onto the runway slowly, almost cautiously, as if they weren't completely certain the ground would hold them. Their legs shook from exhaustion and tension. Their hands trembled from the cold and the long hours gripping metal. Their faces were pale, eyes still wide from the adrenaline that had kept them alive. Ground crews rushed toward the plane, shouting in disbelief. They had seen damaged bombers return before, but this one looked like it had survived the impossible. Holes punched through the wings. Torn metal hanging like broken feathers. Engines blackened. The tail section cracked. The glass in several windows shattered. It was a miracle the aircraft was still in one piece. But the miracle wasn't the plane. It was the men inside it. The pilot climbed down last. He touched the nose of the bomber gently, the way someone might touch the shoulder of a tired friend. He whispered something no one else heard, a thank you, maybe, or a goodbye. Machines don't live or breathe, but in war they become something more. They become protectors, partners, silent witnesses to fear and bravery. The crew gathered together beside the plane. No one spoke at first. They simply looked at each other, sharing a quiet understanding. There were no dramatic speeches, no tears, no loud celebrations. Just a deep, slow breath that passed between them like wind through a field. They had done it. 25 missions. The number meant more than survival. It meant hope. It meant the chance to go home. Later, when the officers read the damage reports, when the mechanics listed all the parts broken, burned, or barely hanging on, it became clear just how close the crew had come to not returning at all. One more hit on the right wing and it would have snapped. One more minute of engine failure and they would have lost altitude too fast to recover. One more enemy fighter staying in the fight might have finished them. But war is filled with thin lines between life and death, between danger and safety, between returning home and becoming another story only whispered about at dinner tables. In the days that followed, the crew was given time to rest. They slept long hours, the kind of sleep that comes only after deep exhaustion. Some wrote letters home. Some walked quietly across the base, letting their hearts settle. Some sat together in silence, replaying the mission in their minds, every sound, every flash of light, every moment when the sky tried to take them. Their plane, the one that had carried them through 25 missions, was taken to the repair area. Mechanics circled it, shaking their heads, touching the torn metal with disbelief. Some said it looked like it shouldn't have flown at all. Others said it was proof of the strength of the B-17. But the crew knew the truth. The plane had held together because it had to. Because quitting was not an option, not for the machine and not for the men guiding it home. Sometimes in the quiet hours of the night, the navigator would remember the German fighter that didn't attack. He wondered why. He wondered who that pilot was. He wondered if, somewhere far away, that pilot was thinking about them too. It was strange how war could bring moments of unexpected humanity, even between enemies. A silent choice that changed everything. The tail gunner often found himself staring at the sky, remembering the endless waves of fighters rushing toward them. He had fired until his arms were numb, until smoke curled around him like mist, until he couldn't feel the cold anymore. But what stayed with him wasn't the firing, it was the moments between attacks, the seconds when the sky fell completely silent and he could hear only his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Those seconds felt more frightening than the battle itself. The bombardier replayed the bombing run many times. He remembered the steady line of flak bursts, the shadowy shapes of explosions glowing through the smoke, the sound of metal tearing apart behind him. But he also remembered the calm voice in his own mind telling him to stay steady, to focus, to do his job. Sometimes bravery is nothing more than doing what must be done even when fear tries to take control. The waist gunners joked softly with each other in the days that followed, trying to shake off the leftover tension. Their laughter wasn't loud. It wasn't joyful. It was quiet and thin, but it helped them heal. Inside those narrow metal walls, they had defended each other again and again. They knew that without each other, none of them would have made it home. The radio operator spent long hours rechecking the messages from that day. He tried to understand why the signal had faded when they needed it most. He tried to learn what he could so the next crew might not face the same silence. His job was not the loudest, not the one that people wrote about in books, but he understood its importance. A single message could save lives. A lost message could cost them. And the pilot, he carried the weight differently. He knew that every decision he made that day had balanced on the edge of disaster. A wrong turn. A delayed correction. A moment of hesitation. Any of it could have been the end. He didn't celebrate finishing 25 missions. He simply sat quietly with the knowledge that he had brought his crew home. That was enough. When the official ceremony came, when medals were given and hands were shaken, the crew stood together. They accepted the recognition with humble nods. The officers spoke about bravery, about skill, about discipline. But when the crew looked at each other, they didn't see heroes. They saw men who survived because they refused to let go of each other. After the war, their lives spread in different directions. Some went home to families who had waited anxiously for every letter. Some built new lives, carrying the memories of the sky deep within them. Some stayed in the service, teaching the next generation of pilots and gunners. But no matter where they went, a part of them remained forever in that bomber, in that sky, in that mission that pushed them to the edge of life itself. Years later, when they looked back, they didn't talk about medals or victory or the grand scale of war. They talked about smaller things. The cold air biting their fingers. The sound of the engines waking before dawn. The laughter shared over tin cups of coffee. The way the sky turned orange during takeoff. The quiet voice of the bombardier saying, "Bombs away." The moment the wheels touched the runway after Mission 25. And the faces of the friends who stood beside them through it all. War may be written in history books, but for the men who lived it, it remains in their hearts, in the soft places of memory where courage and fear are forever tied together. Their survival was not just a victory. It was a reminder of what human beings can endure, what they can overcome, what they can protect when they stand as one. In the years that followed, the war slowly faded into memory, but memories are strange things. They do not vanish. They sink quietly into deeper layers of the mind, waiting for quiet evenings, soft sunsets, or distant echoes to rise again. For the crew of that battered B-17, the war did not stay on the battlefields of Europe. It lived inside them, shaped them, changed the way they saw the world. When they returned home, people often asked them what it was like up there, so high above the earth, facing danger every minute, watching the sky turn into a storm of fire and metal. The men tried to explain, but words can never fully capture the feeling of drifting between life and death with nothing but thin air holding you up. Some described the cold, how it cut into their skin until they felt numb. Others spoke of the noise, the endless roar of engines that followed them long after the war ended. Some remembered the smell of gunpowder and oil mixing together at 20,000 feet. Most found themselves pausing, searching for the right words, but the right words didn't always come. Because the truth was simple, it wasn't just a war story. It was a story of being human in the most difficult conditions. A story of fear that never fully went away. A story of courage that didn't feel like courage at the time. A story of friendship so strong it held them together when everything else was falling apart. They had faced the impossible and survived. But survival didn't mean forgetting. Late at night, when the world was quiet, the memories returned in pieces. The flash of flak bursting outside a frosted window. The shaking floor beneath their boots. The sound of the pilot's calm voice cutting through the chaos. The shadow of a German fighter rising behind them. The strange moment of mercy when that same enemy chose not to fire. These memories were heavy, but they were also precious. They reminded the crew why they lived the way they did after the war, with gratitude, with respect for every ordinary day, with a sense of how fragile life can be. Sometimes, at reunions, the men would sit together and talk about the war. Their hair had turned gray, their faces lined with years, but when they spoke of the missions, something young appeared in their eyes again. Not youth the way the world sees it, but the youth of shared experience, the youth of having faced a storm together and found a way through. They didn't tell these stories to impress anyone. They told them because they knew the stories mattered. They showed what people can do when they refuse to give up. They showed how strong the human spirit can be, even in the darkest skies. Over time, new generations were born. Children, grandchildren, even great-grandchildren. They listened to the stories with wide eyes, amazed at what their families had endured. These younger generations had never heard the engines thunder at dawn, never seen the sky crack open under enemy fire, never felt the cold bite into their bones. But through the stories they learned. They learned that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to keep going despite it. They learned that true strength comes not from being tougher than others, but from standing together when the world turns against you. They learned that sometimes the smallest choice, a split second of humanity like the German pilot turning away, can change the course of a life. And they learned that history is not made only by leaders or generals, but by ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. As the crew grew older, each man understood something that only time can teach. Life after war is a different kind of journey. It is quieter, gentler, but it requires its own kind of courage. The courage to keep living fully. The courage to forgive what cannot be changed. The courage to hold on to hope even when memories feel heavy. One crew member once said, "Survival isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of understanding." Perhaps he was right. Because surviving 25 missions didn't simply mean they escaped death. It meant they learned how important life truly is. How important peace is. How important every small moment becomes when you have seen how quickly moments can disappear. And this brings us to a deeper truth, one that reaches far beyond the war, far beyond the cockpit of a B-17, far beyond the boundaries of any time or place. Courage is quiet. It is found in the steady hand guiding a plane through a storm. It is found in the voice that stays calm when the world is breaking apart. It is found in the friend who refuses to leave your side. It is found in the choice to show mercy, even in a moment shaped by violence. And it is found in the heart that continues to beat with hope even when surrounded by darkness. War is terrible. It takes many things from the world. But sometimes, it reveals the strength that lives inside human beings. Sometimes, it shows how deeply people can care, how far they will go to protect one another, how much courage can exist in the quiet spaces of fear. The story of this B-17 crew is not just a story of survival. It is a story of unity, resilience, and the strange way hope can survive in the harshest places. It is a reminder that even in a world filled with conflict, humanity can still shine through, in friendship, in sacrifice, in unexpected mercy, in the simple act of holding on one more day. And as we listen to their story now from a time long past but never forgotten, we can still learn from them. We can learn to face our own storms with steady hearts. We can learn to trust the people standing beside us. We can learn to see the humanity even in difficult places. And we can learn that no matter how dark the sky becomes, the will to endure can carry us through. Perhaps this is the true legacy of their 25 missions. Not just the battles they survived but the lessons they carried home. Lessons that echo across generations, reminding us that courage, kindness, and unity are powerful forces, strong enough to guide us through even the hardest journeys. Their story ends where many others began, with a damaged plane rolling to a stop, and a group of exhausted men stepping onto the runway. But in that simple moment, after everything they had been through, there was a quiet truth glowing in their hearts. They had made it home. And the world was better because of it.